Welcome back. I'm sorry for the lines out there for the coffee. We'll try and do something about that tomorrow. We're going to move straight on to our second case study on Roy Lichtenstein's Three Brushstrokes piece, which is here at the Getty, outside the GRI currently, and the maquette for which is in our special display. And our three speakers are Jack Cowart, who's founding executive director of the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation, Julie Wolfe, associate conservator at the J. Paul Getty Museum, and the discussion will be moderated by Glenn Phillips, who's senior project specialist of contemporary programs and research at the Getty Research Institute. So please welcome Jack, Julie, and Glenn.
Can you hear us all right? No. Are the microphones on? Okay. Are they on now? Okay. Well, thanks again, everyone, for coming. One of the ideas behind this conference, as we were sort of putting it together, has been to think about the different types of ways that art historians and conservators approach objects, and to think about the very different types of things that they see when they look at objects. And also think about how productive it can be to have conservators and art historians looking at objects together. And I can give a really basic, very simple example of this related to Roy Lichtenstein's 1984 sculpture, Three Brushstrokes, which you see on the screen here. And as Tom said, Three Brushstrokes is installed in front of the Getty Research Institute here on the Getty campus, so we hope you all get a chance to go see it while you're here. Julie and I first saw the sculpture when she and I, together with Andrew Perchuk, who's the assistant director at the GRI, and the Getty Museum's conservator, Brian Considine, visited this piece in a storage facility before it came to the Getty Center. And as soon as it was unwrapped, Andrew and I just looked at each other and started discussing how the yellow looked wrong somehow, which I think is a sort of intuitive thing that a scholar might know based on previous knowledge of an artist's work. And as soon as Brian and Julie looked at the piece, they immediately said, well, it's been repainted, which is the type of thing that a conservator can immediately know when examining a work. So by looking at the work together, we sort of immediately were able to establish something about this piece that needed to be researched. Because not only had the piece been repainted, but it might have been repainted the wrong color. And in fact, the piece had been repainted the wrong color. And if we could see the next slide, Julie will describe some of the research she's done into Lichtenstein's paint colors later in the discussion. But here you can see the sculpture compared to a maquette for the piece, which we also have on display in the small exhibition for the conference. But Lichtenstein's sculptures present some other issues that are fascinating both to conservators and art historians, and a lot of that has to do with these sculptures' relationship to painting. Of course, Lichtenstein moved into sculpture from painting, and he really carried over a lot of his approach as a painter into his process of making sculpture. So that even when he was working out the composition, for instance, of these outdoor sculptures, he was often working much like a painter. And obviously, painting is the subject matter of these sculptures as they depict these cartoon renditions of brushstrokes, which is to say, Lichtenstein takes the ultimate sort of two-dimensional depiction of a brushstroke, this line drawing, and he extends that into three-dimensional space. But in the first few years, sort of at the beginning of the period when Lichtenstein was making these outdoor sculptures, he also had them hand-painted. So that if you look at the original surface of these early sculptures, you see that hand-painted surface, which has a very characteristic texture, and which looks quite different from a spray-painted surface, which poses a little bit of a dilemma for us because the basic conservation approach to most outdoor sculpture is to repaint them as needed, and with an eye towards the durability of the painted surface. And of course, there's not much choice with that, because being exposed to weather conditions are obviously going to accelerate the decay of any painted surface. And we also know that Lichtenstein eventually switched to spray painting for these sculptures, not only for his later sculptures, but also as a means of refinishing the earlier hand-painted sculptures when necessary. So we have another question to think about with 3 brushstrokes, which is whether the sculpture should eventually be repainted by hand, as it was originally, or if we should use spray painting, which is maybe the more typical approach now, and which might be more durable. And we'll start today by having Jack Cowart talk a little bit about Lichtenstein's process of developing and producing these sculptures. And then Julie Wolfe will describe some of the research and treatments we've already done here at the Getty. And then we'll use the remaining time to discuss some of the larger issues raised by the piece. So I'll turn things over to Jack.
Thank you, Glenn. This is, I think, a more empirical and a colloquial kind of presentation than the first lead-off session. But and we've also agreed to interrupt each other. So we're not quite sure which way this is going to go, but you know, stay tuned. I'm interested in the fact that this project with Lichtenstein really is kind of complexity which is inside seeming simplicity. And I am constantly surprised at we're dealing with 3 brushstrokes standing here, exactly why are we spending so much time on it? But we have been for about the last 6 or 8 months trying to unpack this very simple-looking object. The Roy Lichtenstein Foundation has actually been working with the National Gallery of Art in setting up an artist material archive, and then for flat works, if you will. And through this initiative by the Getty in preserving their own piece, really having a lot of fun working with them on the 3D, the sculptural outdoor materials. And it is showing us a lot of things that we really didn't think that we needed to know, but all are critical. Roy Lichtenstein started making sculpture in 1949, and he continued it throughout his entire life. And so his oeuvre in this period from 1949, where he was carving and hand painting and then doing some casting work, and this is all pre-pop, to 1997 is about 225 sculptures. So it is reminds us that it is of some significance. And I still cannot presume to speak for Roy, knowing him 20 years didn't make a great deal of difference in my understanding of his own thought pattern. But we at the Foundation are also doing an oral history program where we are deposing and interviewing all of Roy's assistants and all of his fabricators. And so this is, hopefully, we would like to avoid the kind of pithy conundrum presented, for example, by the Mondrian in the first session. Roy did esteem Get Mondrian, so this carries us back and forth into the history of art. Were you going to advance me to a very pale-looking drawing, and it is a series of artist sketchbooks that we have in the estate and the Foundation, and it really is Roy's first iteration of working with these liquid brushstrokes, which he was amused by freezing in bronze, as he did in the early 1980s, and then in aluminum in the mid-80s and going forward, and also because of the fabrication ability to build bigger and bigger in fabricated aluminum rather than cast bronze. So it would have begun more or less in this way. There's a lot of generative material we don't have, but this is kind of symbolic of his graphite on sketchbook and doodling, and kind of beginning to sense which way a project might go. Another subsequent stage would be to make a collage. This is a larger scale work that on foam core, and it is using painted papers. This is my old Matisse paper cutout background, which I always enjoy working with artists who work that way. The idea of painting up papers in this kind in Magnacolor, which would be a painting material that Roy would have used in his oils on canvas, and is Magna on canvas, with some black tape. And we'd love to show this to you in flesh. It would have been a good addition to the display in the pavilion, but it's missing in action. From this would have been constructed then I will go back to before we get this. This is a studio shot where you find an open file drawer of the kind of cuttings that Roy would kind of inventory or just bank up for future use, or instead of throwing them away, they were put in flat files to give you some of the texture of the working method for Roy and his brushstroke works. Some of these would then be turned into small foam core, kind of funky-looking maquettes, where we have our own T-pins instead of push pins and thumb tags that we preserve, and it did not lead to a sculpture that we know of, but it was just working with forms and space, or colors, and working with diagonals and the attitudes of the complexity of these relationships of these brushstrokes.
He wouldn't sketch a sort of 3D rendering of something before he worked it out with the 2D elements like this.
Well, the sketching would imply something, but Roy's sculptures are really 2 dimensions turned a bit, and where the front is the same as the back. And I made the error of calling them thin to him one day, and he said, no, these actually have relief, a half an inch. These were important nuances for an artist who didn't want you to believe that he was being very precise and nuanced, that these were very natural. But the idea is that he wouldn't do a CAD projection. He would work it out in kind of the handwork of just the malleability of the forms, and with nothing very serious in mind. And then one of the foam core maquettes would have been handed over to an assistant who was one of the model maker and working with Roy on contract. And this would then be carved in wood. And I was in rooms various times where Roy would then nuance these and ask Carlos Ramos, who was the maker, to shave an edge here and to adjust a light there, and just getting the form. And at this stage, it would be just raw wood. And then the idea of painting the color choices would come along in the next stage. For some of the works that were less than 12 feet or less, there would be go to the fabricator would be the next stage, and the idea of mocking this up. And this is an early work, the lamp from the late 1970s, early 80s, as a commission where he would, I think he was insecure about what the fabricator might do, so he decided to make it blindly obvious, and that this was a big mock-up on foam core, and it was using tape and more of magna-painted paper and diagonal striping material, which had been printed papers that he would then collage up. So these are large, full-scale collages, one-dimensional. You go to fabricator. Obviously, the fabricator then has to figure out all the engineering techniques of how to make these works for things like brushstrokes, which are in fact 3 or 4 inches deep. They have a hollow core, so it's a question of then stresses and the engineering details that would make it stand up and to various seismic conditions or wind loads, and these all kinds of shears that you would look at, and also that would be strong enough in the interior guts to keep the sheet aluminum flat enough so you would not get a ripple. So, then these would be done by the fabricator. In this case, this is Paul Amaral Fabrication, where we're fabricating works as I speak. And a shot from the way we got from the paper to collage, which is kind of the final form element to the wooden maquette. Then Roy's studio assistant, James Pasquale, who may be mentioned later as we go on, will blow up, enlarge photomechanically the collage to full-scale foam core in many bits and pieces, and then those foam cores are sent to the fabricator. The fabricator cuts those out around with James's lines, which are speaking for Roy's lines, And these are laid over aluminum sheet forms that would then be cut and to decide the welds and the final detailing and how they get pieced together. And so what we see here on the screen are these white foam core parts laid over a sculpture which we are currently building off of a maquette, which started with a collage, which was a small drawing. And this is a little bit of grittiness to show you that, see inside one of these brushstroke forms laid down where you can see your spans and your stretcher and your strainer elements that keep it together. This is a 30-foot piece, which is larger than the three brushstrokes here, but so it presents other problems. Also, three-joint pieces with a suspended element in the middle. So the engineering is a bit more complicated, but this is the stage that usually I like to get into it because it's nice and it's wonderful to see these the brushed aluminum as it's being welded and torched to then take on something very a beautiful finish, all of which is hidden, and it's always hiding the inherent material. Roy denied his materials by paint whenever possible. You take beautiful cast bronze, which we would love, and it's not about patination, it's not a bronzing of it, it's about painting it over. So it could be made of wood, concrete, aluminum, stainless steel, mahogany. It doesn't make much difference to the artist.
Although some of his bronze works do, the black colors are patinations, but then the rest of the colors would be paint. Isn't that?
Yes, for 4 years though, I showed wooden maquettes painted black, and nobody figured out that they weren't the real sculpture. Please.
Okay, all right. But another step after the fabrication is then the painting. And
right.
So often when the sculpture had been completed with fabrication, it was primed at the fabricators, probably a spray application. And then James Pasquale would come to either the studio or the piece would go back to the studio at Southampton, and he would do the hand painting himself. So that's just to kind of finish off that story. But I thought I would jump back to the Getty sculpture and just talk a little bit about some specifics of that, but then go into how working on this piece has expanded into a really nice, broader collaboration, which we're really excited to engage in. So it was, as Glenn said, it was clear to us that it looked like it had been repainted, and you can see in the slide some details where there were paint losses when I came to the Getty. And you could see they were definitely, like in the yellow, there was a lighter, paler yellow that was underneath that was visible. And you could see evidences of a kind of a more vivid red underneath, kind of a darker color. So it seemed kind of clear from that it looked like, well, yes, it's been repainted. The materials, the research laboratory at the GCI has also, we've taken some cross sections of the paint from each of the colors, and they have been, under Alan Phoenix's direction, he's been kind of analyzing these cross sections and has also been able to confirm that, yes, in fact, there are definitely, there is an original paint layer underneath, and then we can also see some overpaint on top. And then when we were contacting the foundation, initially, we spoke with the artist assistant who did paint this originally, and he sent us some paint swatches to give examples of what the colors looked like originally. And we could tell also by comparing, these are pieces of paper that have been painted with Magna paint. And we could tell that, yes, in fact, the existing red, existing yellow that is there now is darker. And the existing red is also darker. So that also gave even more evidence. When we looked through the, this sculpture belonged to a private collection, Ray Stark. And when we looked through his archives, we were also able to find some evidence that it had been repainted. There's some dialogue from conservators with the foundation about that indicated that there were some issues with the paint failing, and that they needed to do some repainting, which we do. So there was some correspondence that we saw, but we do not have a lot of details on specifically what happened, other than the fact that it was repainted by a local fabricator here in LA.
I just wanted to clear the record because the foundation began in 1999. And what we have here are a couple of good classic situations. One, James de Pasquale, who was Roy's painting assistant in Southampton in the early 1970s, who then, over the succeeding years, became Roy's painting assistant when Roy was working in Southampton. It's also his primary sculpture assistant and the one who really did all of the heavy lifting for all of the sculpture. So we have an assistant who is, in fact, the arm by extension of the artist, point one. And it's run like a studio. This is an artist studio. The people who came back to Roy with a work that had been damaged or was needed to be repainted or some such would have encountered a studio manager at Roy, and then maybe one of his assistants. And Roy would have handed off that work to a nice studio assistant or the nice studio manager, and then they would put together the response, as opposed to something that would have been the way we do it a little differently now for the foundation, obviously, with art historians employed and a catalog resume and process and a number of other quality control issues that we're trying to improve. But there was this period, certainly, that Roy, when he made a work, really didn't give much thought to how, and he would just hope that he got the color right.
And to answer your question, the correspondence for the repainting was in 1993, 1994. Thank you. That's great to clarify that. So when the sculpture came to the Getty, we decided, okay, it's been repainted, the colors aren't right. We're being, we feel that we need to correct that. So we see some repainting in the future. But because we had acquired 28 sculptures as part of this START collection at one time, and we had 1 year to install all of them, we really didn't have time to do any major treatments. And we really wanted to live with the piece for a while and just get to know it. And even though we had an example of what colors should be, we wanted to look beyond color and really understand his process with more detail before we did anything. We did have to do, and I'll just talk briefly about it, an immediate treatment just to stabilize the paint surface, which, as you all know, wears in the outdoor environment. We had a lot of corrosion pustules forming, mostly in the yellow paint. We had blanching of the clear coat, and we had a bit of peeling of the clear coat and also some scratches. So we just decided to deal with these issues locally, and I worked closely with some technical representatives from DuPont who supply the Imron paint systems. We did use Imron to do our local repainting and repairs, and worked closely with them to get some color matches so that we could do some localized painting. That's a whole other challenge to discuss. It's very difficult to actually work on the pieces like this and actually get a good color match and have it not be visible. So we did do a little bit, as you can see on the right, I'm just toning a loss that I filled with some Imron. And I was able to get some good color matches to do local work using Imron, but not all of the colors. The blue was particularly difficult. I couldn't use Imron because I just couldn't get the color to match. And so I ended up having to make my own paint system just using a clear coat and ultramarine pigment. And these are just some shots just to show how on the bottom, in the white paint, we have peeling paint where I've done some repainting, and then also an example of before and after blanching the treatment. So that was just very brief, but an example of how instead of doing a major treatment, we decided to take our time and really only just deal with some of the immediate issues that were a problem that had to deal with the appearance and stability of the paint. So, but while we were doing this, we were in dialogue with the foundation about trying to learn as much as we could about how the piece looked originally and to learn about the process that was used for making these sculptures. And it started where Katrina Posner and I went to the foundation in New York, and we were invited to go through the archives and do as much research as we could on the piece. And they were kind to invite James de Pasquale to come to New York when we were there, and he was able to talk to us and look at this wood maquette with us and explain the process. So we immediately were able to learn an incredible amount. And what really happened was we were amazed, really, about how open-armed the foundation was, really, to invite us to come and do research and really go out of their way to give us as much information as possible. And we were also interested to speak with James Pasquale, who I believe hasn't really been a part yet of the oral history project. It's on a long list, I'm sure. And so we recognized that really nobody's documented thoroughly Roy's sculptural process, and that this was a really good, timely project to really broaden go beyond the Getty sculpture and really broaden our scope of collaboration. So I enticed some scientists at GCI to join in on this. So Tom Lerner and Rochelle Grabank at GCI and Modern Materials, and then also in MRL, Alan Phoenix, have joined together with me, and we are now kind of doing a more elaborate collaboration. We started by going to the artist studio in Southampton, and we met with James, you see in the picture with Alan, and we interviewed him. And then we also, at a very quick day, we ran around and looked at a lot of sculptures in the vicinity together. And this is an example of 5 brushstrokes and Larry Bogosian's. I have also been going to some of the fabricators. I've only been to Emerald's right now, hope to go more, to interview the fabricators about the process, and was able to even see some fabrication process going on for this an artist group of this particularly that's happening right now. We were able to take samples and look at and discuss with James the types of materials he was using. We learned about all the paints, and we're going to be kind of housing an archive of this. And Alan, Tom, Rochelle have been analyzing these paints, and we now have kind of we're starting a good database for reference. While we were going through the studio, we were also able to find some gems that the foundation hadn't found as well. These are examples of coupons of early paint systems that Roy was playing around with, and so it was nice to be able to do things like that. And we also got James to make some sample paint systems for us. He basically, I'm going to have to speed up because of time, but his early systems, because he wanted to Roy really wanted the goal was to match Magna paint colors using outdoor paints, which was very difficult for him to do. You couldn't really do that with Imron. So originally he would first coat with Imron paint, and then he would paint on top of that using a clear coat that's with Magna mixed in. So that was his original paint systems. And when those started to age, and some of them kind of maybe failed, which is you kind of expect. Anyway, fair enough. But they started to kind of try different systems. And they moved to Imron, just Imron. They've also tried using another paint system called All Grip, where they felt that the paint systems, even though it wasn't perfect, they compromised for just to use a purely industrial product. And so it was interesting to hear from him on that process.
I think we're almost out of time, but maybe in just the last minute or so, if we could look at the examples showing the difference between the hand-painted and the spray-painted surfaces, and maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Time goes by so fast.
Yeah, we went. One thing that as we were saying early on, he hand-painted a lot of the sculptures. This is a detail of one where you see an original hand-painted surface, and this is a detail of another sculpture that is later that was originally spray applied, and this is using all grip paint. And there's a big difference in the surface.
But could you say, and I mean, to me, it's visually, obviously, it's hugely different, but could you say a word just about durability, or what might be the advantages or disadvantages to one? I mean, obviously, I think, time is one, I think, with some of the massive sculptures, there would really be no way to hand paint them. But what are, just briefly?
Well, if you were to think like a conservator, I think it would be, if you wanted to have a more durable, paint application, a spray application would be probably a little bit more durable in the long term. And that's always something to consider. If you were to think more like kind of a historian, or perhaps the piece was originally painted. And it definitely had an appearance. The appearance isn't all about color, it's also about texture and translucency. And so I think that I think there's something to be said for repainting using a brushed application. So.
Well, there's definitely a sort of interpretive richness, I think, that comes from the hand-painted surface, because the piece has so much to do with painting. And that's all we're going to say, because I don't know.
But we'll be back.